All right, I think we're gonna get this started. So, welcome to our Training Tuesday. This is our ABC Trainings Tuesday, part 4. And today we have the title, A Look to the Future, where 3D technology to understand, design, and management almond orchard systems. I'm Sebastian Sa. I'm the Associate Director of Agriculture Research here at the Almond Board. And today we have aligned two speakers from UC Davis. They are both going to share the latest results of their research projects and, more importantly, illustrate how they have taken the opportunity to use 3D technology to understand and answer very fundamental and also very important horticulture questions. So first we have Brian Bailey, and then we're going to follow with Astrid Volder. Again, both are from the University of California, Davis, and they will share the results on how three-dimensional computer ID design will allow our industry to gain new knowledge in horticulture management. They are going to walk us through topics like irrigation system, water-soil transport, and we're going to close with a lot of roots and tree canopy conversations. So with that said, I think Miranda has some housekeepings to share with us, and then we're going to kick off with Brian. Thank you both.
Thank you, Sebastian. So just a few reminders about Microsoft Teams. All attendees will be muted and you'll have no access to your cameras. However, throughout the course, we ask you to please utilize the chat function and where you can post your questions, and there'll be many opportunities during our Q&A to address your questions. Also during Q&A, we'll restrict the mute and camera option. So if you want to verbally ask your questions, you can do so. We ask for you to please raise your hand by the this smiley face emoji so we can get an order of go of who can ask their questions next. And then also, this training does not require a CU credits, but please stay tuned for future trainings for CU credit opportunities. And then with that, I will pass it over to Brian Bailey.
All right, let's get the screen going here. All right, I'm gonna assume that all is working. You can hear me okay? So thanks for the opportunity to be here. Again, I'm Brian Bailey, an assistant professor from the Department of Plant Sciences at UC Davis. So for my talk, I'm going to kind of give an overview of the work that we've done that spans multiple projects related to 3D measurement and modeling of almond orchard systems. So I'll kind of give an overview of the framework that we've been developing, which I think will transition nicely into some of the work that Astrid has been doing, looking at a very important component of the system, which is the root systems. So before I dive in, I want to just take a one slide detour to kind of motivate this idea in general. So I come originally from an engineering background. That's where I initially did my university education. And as kind of a budding engineering student, we worked quite a bit with these 3D computer-aided design or CAD software design systems. And these are pretty pervasive across pretty much any engineering type discipline. And they've really revolutionized a lot of industries in terms of the design process and how they bring products to market. So if you're not familiar, these essentially are 3D models where it allows you to build up your design in this highly realistic 3D simulated environment and then run them through different models or simulations. If you're designing an airfoil, running them through different fluid mechanics simulations. And this allows you to understand kind of how things work in a simulated sense before actually taking the plunge and prototyping, which can often be quite costly and time consuming. And so this is obviously a talk about modeling in orchard systems, but I think there are a lot of similarities in design and management of orchard systems and just generalized engineering systems. We also have here a very complex system with a lot of different parts that interact. And if you just change one piece of the system, that usually doesn't just change in isolation, it changes how kind of everything fits together and works together. Also, in the case of an orchard system, prototyping, or what we would more commonly call field trials, is also pretty costly and time consuming. It can take a lot of effort and time before we actually understand how things work and are willing to move that into production. And also the optimal design now may no longer be the optimal design in the future as climate or socioeconomic conditions change. We often need to think into the future of how to make things sustainable across, potentially 20 years or longer. So if we had this sort of realistic simulation system to incorporate within the agricultural design and management sort of framework, I think there are a lot of potential benefits that this would add, and also potentially increase the rate at which we can innovate and move the industry forward. So the idea is that, if we start with some idea or question we want to explore, maybe a different cultivar, different row spacing, planting in a different location, etc., we could first explore that in a simulated environment and understand the different strengths and weaknesses, project out into the future, and then use that to kind of narrow down the range of possibilities that we might want to try in a field trial, which is going to take much longer to carry out. So the simulation step is much faster. We can turn through a lot of different ideas and use that to help guide essentially experiments that are going to be more costly and time consuming. So just like in the engineering example, we're not looking to completely remove experiments or field trials, but add an additional tool that can complement them and make them more effective. And so, as you can probably guess, what we've been working on over the past 5 years or so is developing such a system that can enable this computer-aided design and management of orchard systems. So we developed this modeling framework that's called Helios. And so it represents the full three-dimensional geometry and complexity of the system, which is necessary if we want to be able to change different parameters without actually having the experimental data that traverses that whole range of conditions that we want to explore. So we can build things up in this realistic environment, run it through different models that are relevant to almond production, like simulating water use, simulating yield dynamics, all sorts of different things. And we can kind of forecast and change different conditions. What if we change the cultivars? What if we change the row spacing? Pretty much the idea is to be able to simulate any design or management practice that you would be able to do in reality. So currently, the framework Helios is open sourced, and so that's important to us to allow others to kind of develop and add to it, as well as understand how it works. It currently doesn't have a graphical user interface. We're working toward that, but right now you work with it kind of more in a programmatic sense through an application programming interface. But the goal is to get it to a point that you would use it similar to like an engineering CAD system, where you could go in and play with these different parameters, run it through different models to simulate light interception or water use efficiency, all sorts of different things, as well as simulate pests and disease. Again, anything relevant to that a manager or designer might consider. The computational complexity that comes with these physically based and detailed models is considerable. And so what we've done to be able to speed that up is to essentially borrow technologies from a different industry that has been dealing with kind of analogous problems for many decades, which is the computer graphics industry. So they are also trying to do these physically based, detailed 3D simulations and do it very fast, such that you have a real-time kind of game. So we the way that they do that is by performing calculations on the graphics processing unit, or GPU. That's essentially a miniature supercomputer inside your desktop and laptop computers already, that can do these types of calculations in parallel very quickly. So we run a lot of the models on the GPU that allows them to be accelerated by 100 times or more, and allow for these to be run on a desktop computer rather than on, say, a supercomputer. So for the rest of this talk, I want to focus on kind of 3 specific example applications or areas that we have really been interested in as we've been developing the initial framework. And so the first is on essentially the inputs to this. So how do we get essentially the measurements or a description of that 3D plant structure? So I mentioned that the approach that we're taking is to be able to represent that full 3-dimensional complexity of the orchard, so that the models are more robust as we start to change different parameters. So I'll talk about some of the different approaches that we've used for that. Next, I'll talk about irrigation. So a lot of our projects so far in building this out have focused on irrigation. So I'll talk about how we've been working to integrate the design of the hydraulics of the irrigation itself, the transfer through the soil and the uptake through the roots, and the above ground evaporative demand in the whole irrigation process. Currently, these different pieces are either separate or not fully included, and so we've been working to use the system to integrate these different pieces. And then finally, I'll just touch on some of the more recent work we've done relevant to artificial intelligence. So we've been working to fuse these detailed 3-dimensional models with artificial intelligence models to kind of get the best of both worlds for each of these and be able to do things that neither one could do on their own. So starting with the measurement of the inputs for the model, or describing the 3-dimensional structure. So what we most commonly use for this is LiDAR. So this is short for light detection and ranging. Essentially, the way that it works is you have this LiDAR or laser scanner, and we can put this scanner on various platforms. You can put it on a tripod, you could put it on a drone, you can put it on a fixed-wing aircraft or even a satellite. But the principle is pretty much the same. So it sends out this concentrated beam of light, or a laser beam. And then if that beam hits some object, some of that light is scattered back to the sensor. And it uses the amount of time that takes, along with a number of different corrections, in order to pretty precisely determine the distance to the object that it hit, as well as the XYZ position in space of the object that it hits. And it can do this millions of times in just a few minutes. So you get this very dense mapping of points all around the scanner. And then if you move it around, then you can cover various distances in order to map out the 3-dimensional structure. And this is just a table kind of showing some of the different platforms that we can use to collect that data, ranging from satellites down to the ground. The important thing to get from this is just that the detail that you can get from the laser scanning changes as you get further from the target that you're interested in scanning. So in order to get kind of leaf scale or branch scale structure that we're often interested in for these detailed models, we need to kind of be closer or at the ground level, because we lose quite a bit of detail as you go further and further away. So at the end, this gives you these very detailed 3-dimensional mappings of the structure of whatever it is that you're trying to scan. This is an example of scanning the almond trees with the leaves off to get the branching type structure. And each of these points are colored based on a different scan location as we moved the scanner around. So it gives you this really rich data set with millions and millions of points mapping out the structure. But then the question immediately is, what do we do with that? Because just millions of points in space are not really that useful often, especially when it comes to getting inputs for models. We really need things like surfaces, and features, not necessarily just points in space. And this has been a big bottleneck in this area, is what do you actually do with all this data? Because you're talking about sometimes gigabytes of data in a single data set for a few trees. So how do we actually use that? And so a lot of what we've been working to do is to develop the algorithms that can take that raw point cloud data and translate it into useful information, specifically useful for modeling or other type of predictive techniques. So I'll talk about some of the processing approaches that we've developed. So we can measure things like leaf angle, leaf area, and do full leaf by leaf reconstructions of the orchard. We can measure the woody structure and reconstruct it using a cylinder-based model, measuring and reconstructing the root structure, which I'll touch on briefly, and then Astrid will follow up with additional information on this. And then something that we're interested in doing in the future, but we haven't yet, is measuring flowers, buds, and spurs to understand the dynamics of yield and development. So I'll touch on each of these quickly. I could give a talk on each one of these individually, but we'll just kind of give the quick whirlwind tour. So we developed algorithms for developing the leaf angle and how it varies in space. So this is critically important for things like light interception, photosynthesis, things like that. As the leaf angle distribution changes, it changes the way that the plants perform and respond to the environment. So we developed a technique that allows us to measure this in 3D and reconstruct these probability distribution functions to understand how it changes in time and space, as well as links to various biophysical processes. We can also measure leaf area, which is equally or more important than leaf angle when it comes to things like light interception and photosynthesis and water use. It's pretty much the amount of vegetative stuff that we have available to carry out those processes. And so the way that we do this is we break up the orchard or tree into these sub-volumes or voxels, and then we can use the LiDAR data to calculate the amount of leaf area inside each one of those volumes. So we can draw these volumes anywhere that we want, and then we use a statistical approach in order to invert and figure out how much leaf area is in that voxel. And the nice thing about the LiDAR is that it penetrates into the canopy, so we can get information deeper into the canopy or within the trees that something like just RGB imagery or photogrammetry can't get, because it can penetrate into the center of the canopy. So then we can combine these different pieces together in order to do a full reconstruction of the plant. So we combine the leaf angle measurement with the leaf area measurement and doing some segmentation or identification of individual leaves. And we can put all this together to come up with a reconstruction of the trees that accounts for not only leaf area that can be viewed from the outside of the tree, but also the occluded part that we can't see based on this statistical inversion of leaf area that I mentioned previously. So this is just a visualization that puts these pieces together that I showed earlier. So here we went in and LiDAR scanned this orchard, ran it through these reconstruction algorithms, and then coupled it with models for light interception, calculating temperature, as well as water use to estimate the water flux for every leaf inside the simulated orchard. And then we can do different things like change the spacing, virtually prune the plants, etc., to understand how it responds, design an irrigation management program specific to the different cultivars that were in this orchard, and various things like that. We've also more recently been working to reconstruct the woody part of the tree, so coming in the winter and scanning things in leaf off conditions. So these reconstructions are not the raw point cloud data, but we've actually gone in and done a cylinder-based reconstruction. So it essentially fits cylinders to all the LiDAR data points to come up with these really detailed structural reconstructions of the trees. And we're using this to understand how differences in the growth structure affect the performance of the orchard and how it responds to different environmental conditions. So you can see that just visually, you can see the differences between the structure of these types of varieties that have different growth habits. And then we're working to quantitatively back out important parameters related to the growth in order to feed those into our models and understand how they affect the performance of the orchard. I mentioned that we're interested in going further and understanding aspects of more detailed processes like spur dynamics and how things evolve over time and space in order to understand what's contributing to the dynamics of yield. And so you can see in some of these scans, you can actually identify the spurs. You can also see buds, as well as flowers are much larger. We can also pick those out of scans. And so combining this with some of the artificial intelligence-based methods that I'll touch on at the end, I think there's a lot of potential to be able to automatically measure these types of things in order to understand how spur populations evolve throughout time and space, and understand what is contributing to yield. Measuring these things directly is extremely difficult and time-consuming, and so we're pretty limited on the data that we have. So being able to measure this autonomously and extract these features, I think, would be a big step forward. So as we mentioned, we're also interested in the roots. So a critical part of the function of the orchard that we, relatively speaking, we have a lot less, more limited understanding of, because they're just really difficult to measure and study. And so Astrid will talk more about this, but we had this project that she led where we air blasted out the roots of mature almond trees, and then we laser scanned them while they were in the ground, and then pulled them out to laser scan them and get different view angles. And so we're working on reconstructions of these, as well as being able to extract quantitative traits, and ultimately develop a model for how this evolves in space, since obviously we can't go and dig out the roots of every tree in every orchard that we want to study or make predictions about. We've also developed within Helios the capability to process airborne LiDAR data, so something collected from a drone or a fixed-wing aircraft, and we can extract a number of different parameters like leaf area index, the leaf area density, which is the 3D variation in leaf area, as well as other two-dimensional quantities. Okay, so shifting gears onto the second part, which is using some of this information in order to better understand and predict how the irrigation system is going to perform, and incorporating this within irrigation system design and management. So I'm going to focus on kind of three different pieces of this and how we've been working to bring these together. The first is on the supply, so the actual hydraulics of the irrigation system itself. So designing it such that it is able to deliver water with the uniformity and rate that is desired. The transfer of the water through the soil, and ultimately how it's taken up by the roots, as well as the demand part, so the actual atmospheric demand from the leaf surface itself. So we've kind of developed this CAD-like system that integrates these different pieces. I'll dive into each component here in the next couple slides, but this is just a visualization showing how all of this potentially works together. So bringing together the hydraulics of the irrigation system, the soil, as well as the above ground demand, to have this CAD-like tool that can allow you to vary the different parameters all together and predict ultimately the water use of the orchard and help to design optimal irrigation management practices. So we could change different parameters, the row spacing, pruning, hedging, things like that, and predict its effect on light interception, water use efficiency, coming up with custom estimates of the crop coefficient, as well as ultimately predicting the potential yield. So how is the supply of water or the irrigation system currently designed? Oftentimes, designers use a CAD-like software to make these types of to produce these types of designs. This is sort of the gold standard, using software such as Irricad that has hydraulic models for designing the irrigation system itself. There are a number of limitations with this. They are based on somewhat simplified physics. We're working to explore how important that is potentially, but we don't quite know yet. But we're using kind of more complex models to understand the performance and potential bottlenecks in these types of representations. They're also closed source software, so from a research perspective, we can't kind of dive in and really understand what they're doing, as well as potentially modify or add on top of them. And they don't really explicitly consider the soil or plant demand. It's not really this coupled system that we are working to develop. So there's a student in the lab that's working on developing an open source CAD irrigation software system. And so ultimately the goal again is to couple that with the soil and the above ground component as well, to do kind of more of a holistic sort of design. And she's working on some additional enhancements that things like Irricad don't have, like explicitly recommending pumps or different parameters that are sort of just inferred from something like Irricad. So next, the transfer of the water once it's delivered from the irrigation system through the soil. I'm sure everyone knows that the specifics of the soil and as well as the root system affect kind of what you can do as far as irrigation. And so currently this is maybe be represented through simplified rules of thumb or based on a qualitative view of soil texture. We do have complex models for water transfer through the soil, such as hydrous, but they're not really scalable to be able to sort of design things through a whole orchard where you might have heterogeneous zones that need to be represented explicitly. And so there's a student in the lab that's working on adding this to Helios to be able to simulate the transfer of water through the soil. And so he dynamically models how the water infiltrates and is ultimately taken up by the roots. There are a number of challenges with getting the inputs for this type of model. First of all, the soil texture information, as it varies, three-dimensionally throughout a given site, as well as the distribution of the roots as well. Again, obviously, we can't go in and measure, the roots system of every type of system. There are databases for getting things, at least an estimate of the soil texture, and then we can come out and do certain limited sampling in order to get a better idea. But as far as the roots go, ultimately what we'd like to develop is a dynamical model that can be able to predict how this evolves throughout time, given the localized conditions. And so we're working with Astrid to lay the foundation to be able to develop this. And finally, the demand portion. So how much water does the plant actually use based on its physiology and the environmental conditions? So often this is represented through relatively simple models such as crop coefficients, which probably many of you are familiar with. The advantage of this is that it's relatively easy to apply, but it can be difficult to generalize. It's based on experiments that are local to certain areas or conditions. And there's often this trade-off between the amount of time that it takes to collect a measurement to get things to be more site-specific versus accuracy and scalability and ease of use that we're constantly sort of juggling. So we're working to use these tools to hopefully bridge that gap and get a better trade-off between these different things. So we have several different projects in this area that I won't go through in detail, but one of them is to generalize crop coefficients, to take the limited amount of experimental data that we have and then get a better site-specific estimate based on local soil conditions based on the cultivar, the configuration of the orchard, using these models. So taking the data that we have and essentially interpolating and extrapolating based on these physically based models. We're also interested in just understanding what are the key quantities that need to be sensed in order to predict water demand locally. So we have often measurements of things like light interception, canopy volume, NDVI from remote sensing, or any number of other products. So what is actually needed and how far can we get based on each of these measurements? We can simulate these things in the models to get a better understanding. And then how can different measurements be used to augment generalized recommendations? So if we use, for example, a crop coefficient most of the time, but then have a few localized measurements to be able to augment or improve those locally. These are things that we're working to understand based on the models. All right, how am I doing on time here? Okay, wrap up with this last section. Just touching briefly on integrating all of this with artificial intelligence based models. So, you know, artificial intelligence is a term that we hear more and more pretty much every day. It kind of has the promise of being able to take all this data that we have available to us and then make sense of it in order to make better predictions and understand trends in the data. But there are a lot of practical applications to actually, practical limitations when it comes to putting these into practice. One of them is that artificial intelligence models require a massive amount of data to train them, just like you know, an agricultural manager takes years of feeding information and in order to understand how things work in order to make predictions. It's kind of the same for an artificial intelligence-based model. And we also have to be able to feed the data with pretty high throughput. So we need to be able to automatically collect the data and potentially be able to label it with what's going on. So potentially having a human to go in and say, what that data actually means, such that the model can learn from it. So this is a huge bottleneck in building out and adopting these types of technologies. But in other industries, such as self-driving cars, they use simulated data in order to help to train the model. So they have some real data and a lot of simulated data that they can use to train the model. So for example, they can run a child out into the simulated road and then see if the car is able to avoid it. Obviously, you wouldn't want to try that in the real world, but they can use these simulations in order to get this data that's needed to train. And because they generated the data, they know everything about it. They can say, this is a tree, this is a child, all of this, because you don't need a human to go in to do it when it's simulated data. So we've been working on creating something similar for agricultural type applications. So we can use the three-dimensional models that are based on physics in order to generate a lot of simulated data that can be automatically labeled or annotated. So we can use the biophysical models to simulate things like RGB imagery, multispectral imagery, LiDAR, thermal data. And because it's coupled with the biophysics of what's going on with the plant, we can automatically label it to say, this was a condition where we had water stress, and so the water content went down, the reflectance changed, the structure changed. All of these things can be generated and automatically labeled, and then we do physical simulations to simulate what the sensor would actually be measuring. And so we still take a little bit of real data, but then we can generate a lot of simulated data that we could never collect in the real world. So here's an example for strawberry, where we've generated all these different simulated data products, and then we can label anything about them that we want. This is a case of artificial lighting on a strawberry plot, and then we generated simulated visible, NIR, different spectral indices, thermal data, LiDAR, and I think this has the potential to be transformative across multiple remote sensing fields, because this is kind of a fundamental challenge: is how do you link what you can measure readily into actionable information relevant to the function of what's actually happening with the plants. Here's an example of visible and near infrared imagery in an orchard where we were automatically labeling the position of the nuts. Okay, so I just wanted to close with this last slide, that just some parting thoughts. So I don't want people to kind of come away from this and thinking that, you know, we just want to model everything and then get rid of ever having to, you know, measure things or collect, you know, field type data. Really, the model is an integrator of all of the knowledge that's being developed across, you know, the state, across the nation or the world. So there's, you know, all sorts of great work and data being collected on these various aspects of the orchard system. And this is really critical for understanding how things actually work. And the thing that the model does is it kind of takes these together and integrates them to understand how different pieces work together, or to be able to interpolate or extrapolate them across different environments, because we can't measure everything everywhere all the time. Often our field experiments are specific to, you know, one set of conditions or one location. And we can only vary maybe a couple of variables at the same time. The model is really a framework that kind of brings that together so that we can understand when we start to change multiple things at the same time, how do they interact? And so I think it's critical to continue investing in you know, high quality fundamental research that understands how things work based on experimental investigations. The model is just a way that kind of brings these things together and acts as an integrator. So that's it. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you, Brian. Very good. I do have a question, but probably for the end. Maybe we jump into Astrid next.
Real quick, Sebastian, do you want to address Carl's question on where can the software be downloaded?
Sure, that would be a question for
Brian.
Brian. I think he yes, step for a second. So let's hold that question for the end.
Okay, we'll come back to that, Carl. Thank you.
Okay, you're able to see my screen? It's all there?
Yes, we can see it perfectly.
Perfect. So, well, Brian already set this up perfectly. I mean, the thing in most of the models when we're thinking about production in orchards is we treat the root system as a black box because it's so difficult to get at. So I'm going to show you some information today as to how we're trying to clarify what should be in the model, and how can we add information to those models related to the root system. So what you can see is, well, I just want to show you some of how we think about the root system in the lab, at least in my lab. First of all, it is just the main part of the tree that is going to take up and move water and nutrients to the shoot. And how efficient it does that is a function of how many roots, young roots I have, how much root surface area there is, and where they are located. Other functions that might be related to the root system would be the storage of carbohydrates. This is how trees are coming out of dormancy at the end of the winter. And I'm working with Maciej Zwiniecki on carbohydrate allocations. Of course, anchoring is very important, but I'll show you some videos that kind of shows that you can anchor trees in many different ways. And then there's some work on rhizosphere that we do in my lab that, you know, probably won't go into a model for a long time. So how I would think about how does the root system relate to the rest of the tree? This is all about balancing growth. And if any of you've ever seen Ted DeYoung talk about balancing growth, you know, very similar to how he explains it. I mean, there's a finite amount of biomass that is being generated in photosynthesis at the shoot level right here. And that biomass can actually be allocated back towards growing more shoot or growing more root. And it depends a little bit on the needs of the tree, how much is going to be reallocated to the root system or stays in the shoot. And so there's a real relationship between what you do to the shoot and what you do to the root. And this root system here is affected by many different things in the soil. So temperature obviously has a huge effect. So there's a temporal dynamic. Temperatures are lower in the winter, higher in the summer. and it affects the growth of the root system, how much water you have in the soil, how much oxygen you have in the soil to make new roots, and of course where the nutrients are. And different types of roots will respond differently to this soil environment. The other thing that is very important and that is really difficult to get at is the soil characteristics. The texture, the structure affect how well the soil is holding on to water, how fast it moves, etc., towards the root surface. So when you think about the root system in a model, there is the root system and its immediate environment, but then there's also whatever you do to the shoot that is going to affect what happens to the root system. I'll show you some data that we've been collecting that is getting at that. So for simplicity's sake, try to think about it in a way as there's three types of roots. There's the very big roots, which are the large diameter roots that are doing the long distance transport of water and nutrients. So they are basically the highways, in many ways, of the root system that spread out all around the tree. These are these big roots here. This, when you would harvest the tree, that would be the majority of the biomass, but not necessarily the majority of the length. And these roots, once they have been established, will stay there for the lifetime of the tree. Then, as opposed to that, on the other end completely, we have the very fine diameter that are very short-lived roots. Those are the roots that are at the tips, at the most external ends of the root system. These are the ones that are active in water uptake and nutrient absorption. So these big ones, they don't take up any water or nutrients, but they transport. But at the end of the root systems, you essentially have the little, you could call it factories that are taking up all of the water and the nutrients and then transporting it back up towards the big roots and then towards the main shoot. The majority of the root length is in these very fine roots. And these fine roots are incredibly responsive to their immediate environment. So they're very important in the models because they are the ones that are going to respond to water availability or nutrient availability. They have a very short lifespan and usually about a couple of months. And I will show you some almond data in a minute. In between these two very different types of roots, going from very large framework roots to very fine diameter roots, there's a third class of roots that is often not studied in the literature, which is kind of interesting. These are the roots that are exploring the soil. So the intermediate diameter roots that you see growing long distances over a couple of months, which is why we call them exploratory roots. And when they hit a favorable patch of soil, they are actually going to proliferate there. And so they basically determine where the plant is going to take up the water and the nutrients. And this is definitely something that we really need to try and get at in the models because it's really hard to track and observe those in a real life situation. Now, the root system is very dynamic. So it shows you some of the tricky parts with developing a model that incorporates the root system because as roots age, this is the oldest part of the root, and you see the root tip here, and it's white. Notice that the roots turn brown, and this is in a matter of weeks. Once they have turned brown, they are no longer permeable to water. So their capacity to take up water and nutrients reduces drastically. So this is why I said you'd have to constantly grow new roots because only when the roots are very young are they very highly active in water and nutrient uptake. So just an example here, we have, the finest roots that I'm talking about. Unfortunately, these very fine roots we cannot see with a LiDAR or a ground penetrating radar. So what we do to measure the dynamics of the production of these very fine roots is we use what we call a mini rhizotron. This is what it looks like. There's a very clear plastic tube inserted into the soil, and it stays there for the duration of the experiment. And we stick a camera into the tube, and we can take pictures out into the soil and track when roots appear or disappear. So an example here, at a 1 week interval, you see fine root appearing. The tip is coming through the soil. Notice it's already a week later, it's already starting to turn a little bit brown at the older part of the root system. And it moves through the soil. Now this part of the root system is 2 weeks old and it has turned brown, and it's exploring the soil further and starting to branch out into side roots. So we can track the dynamics of those fine roots through time, and what you will see, notice that we are now at week 7. Some of the roots that appeared earlier have already disappeared, some of those fine roots. So the lifespan of those very fine roots is very short. And so this helps us kind of keep track as to under what conditions we see the fine roots appear, and at what time, basically interval, is the root system most active in water and nutrient uptake. So here's some data from a large trial that we planted in 2015 in Davis, and you can see that we have a large amount of roots being produced right now, actually, between April through about middle of July. You see the peak of fine root production, and then after that we see very little new root production. So this period of time would be essential in say, models like Brian's model, to model where and when these fine roots exactly appear in the soil. Are they in the topsoil? What happens when we irrigate differently? What happens when we prune, etc.? And so I want to just point out that compared to the manuals, this is the typical pattern that you see in the almond manual. This is not what we have observed in any of our experiments. We have mini rhizotron tubes at multiple sites, but none of them show this massive fall peak. So then the question is, so what happens when we start manipulating the tree? What happens to these patterns of root production? So in this same experiment, we decided to look at what happens when you head and prune the tree at planting, a very common practice. So here you see the just planted trees, headed and pruned. This is at the end of that, at the end of a 2-year period. And here we didn't do anything to the tree. We just let it grow. And after 5 months, and this graph represents standing root length and soil depth. So the deeper I go in y-axis here, you'll see reduced root production somewhat. So in the shallow soil, after 5 months of planting, very little roots, fine root is standing, but the majority of the fine roots are standing around 40 to 60 centimeters. So that's in the 1 to 2 foot range. And notice the 2 lines, unmanaged, the one we didn't head or prune, and headed and pruned, which is the red line. Down to about 80 centimeters, the root production pattern is identical. But then below 80 centimeters, you see that the trees that were headed and pruned have much reduced standing root length. So the practice of heading and pruning at planting really reduced deep root growth. And that could be very important, and that's very important to actually incorporate into a model, because it shows you how a management practice changes the allocation through the soil volume. What this means is we have much reduced deep roots in the headed and pruned trees, i.e. they cannot acquire as much water and nutrients from that soil depth later in the summer. Other information that we get from these mini rhizotron tubes is where and at what depth are the roots being produced. This is the period over the summer. Notice that we find most of the root growth is in the topsoil, which is not that surprising, as that's where irrigation takes place. The soil was probably quite dry at deeper layers. And then if we look at what's being produced over the fall, we do see some root production, but now it's in the much deeper soil layers. So that helps hopefully improve the models again in terms of periods of root growth at various depths through time. So something to remember in this model here is you cannot grow these fine roots in an area if you don't have the coarse roots there yet. And for almond trees, at least, we know very little about the coarse root distribution. So we decided to, at the end of that experiment, to dig out the trees. And Brian already showed some of the images. Here's one of my students. She's doing the air blasting of the soil away from the roots. There's a lot of work. We air blasted out 36 trees. So there were 6 rows of this. And we purposely used air, not water, so we would actually be able to see the roots. And we cleaned up under all of the root systems. And then Brian came in with the LiDAR scanner to really get at the 3D structure of the root systems. And these were all with different treatments, different pruning treatments, as well as different scions and different irrigation levels across time. We then would pull the trees out and actually measure the biomass. We also did this at various points through time. So in this case, we would air blast this tree at year 2, and then would just refill the soil and look at what it looks like a couple of years later. And notice that there's a huge tangled mass of roots. Also, for those of you interested in that, when you root prune at planting, you'll see that there's a lot of new roots being produced. Then we decided to pull the trees out, and just in case, and then rescan them so that we could get a more detailed picture of the root architecture and also get biomass. So notice on this that the majority of the root system is extremely shallow, and yet it was very difficult to rip that tree out. There was also no soil on top of the center of the root system, but the tree was still very much strongly anchored by all of these extending roots throughout the whole orchard. So this is very interesting because this basically is the framework for water uptake. So the more of these big roots you have spreading all around the orchard, the greater your potential for water uptake. Oh, go to this. So just want to clarify that the root system is not a mirror image of the top of the tree. It doesn't grow really deep. In fact, it grows very much sideways. So this is what it looks like once we've pulled them out. You see all the root systems sitting here, and then we would lift them up and Brian would scan them again. But I highlighted here a few roots that were sticking out. There are a few for each tree extremely vertical roots, and those roots go way deeper than all the other roots. And those could be extremely important for water uptake. And it's something that is going to be very difficult still to get at. If we soil core or dig or rip out trees, we don't really get at the depth, the full extent to how deep these roots go, but they could be very important in water uptake if they, once they go further, branch out again and actually have a lot of new root growth deeper. So in terms of growth of these trees, the impact of pruning, so we had multiple irrigation treatments as well, full irrigated and 30% less irrigation. We found that once you prune those trees, the above ground growth, which is the stem area increase, was drastically reduced. And the effect of pruning was actually much stronger than the effect of irrigation. And digging out these trees further, we actually found that what changes a lot is the root mass fraction. So the hashed bars here are prune trees. This is the root mass fraction. So that's how much of your total biomass is allocated towards the roots. And just the simple act of pruning reduces the amount of biomass allocated to the root system. So the prune trees overall were smaller, but for whatever biomass they had, they still allocated less to the root system as well. So something that we really need to represent in the models is when we do management practices, is that there's a change in allocation of energy to the root system when you prune, in this case. Also, but it's also true when you're heading. I wanted to point out a new paper that's come out fairly recently. It's all about root depth observations in nature, so it's very different than in an orchard situation. But first of all, I wanted to show you the scale. So in this top left, they plotted it as a function of annual rainfall in natural environments. So 1,000 millimeters, that's a lot of rainfall. That's 40 inches per year. But notice the scale on the rooting depth. A fair few of the trees fall between 10 meters, which is 30 feet, and 100 meters, which is 300 feet. So there are trees that are very deep rooted. And when you look at which type of plants are so deep rooted, you can see that here's root depth again on the y-axis. Between the 10 and the 100 meters, we see a lot of them are the trees, not surprisingly, of course. But the very interesting thing about this paper, and this is pretty relevant for almonds, is that the actual maximum rooting depth was very much determined by how deep the water table was. So for those people that want to plant in the delta, for example, you wouldn't expect very deep rooting. But if you have a very deep soil and the water table is far away, you can get actually very deep rooted trees. The other analysis in that paper, which we need to double check with the almonds, is what happens when you have a situation where you would have a lot of rainfall coming in from the top or not. And so if you are in a situation where you have a lot of water coming in at the top all the time, your root system is going to stay very shallow. If you are going to be in a situation where you are going to have a dry season, which is more the Mediterranean type that would happen in California, you would want to encourage a deeper water table in the winter so that the roots go relatively deep. Then they cross this dry zone and they will be able to tap the groundwater that's there. Because the part here is that the roots will actually follow wet season water infiltration. So if I have good drainage, they may be able to pass this gap here of dry soil and start growing roots into the groundwater table. If I have excellent drainage, then this air gap is too great and they might not actually go that deep. So these are some of the situations we would want to check with our various rootstocks in almond to see what kind of root distribution we're going to get. The ideal scenario would be to encourage roots to grow very deep in the spring so that they hit the water reservoirs that are deeper and we'll be able to tap that over the summer. So this is also related to some of the other projects that the Almond Board funds on the timing of irrigation. If you hold off on making spring irrigation, you might be able to get the root system to grow deeper in the spring and have the roots there for your summer water availability. So there are lots of unknowns. Rootstock is going to change completely what kind of root system you're going to get. We're also looking at propagation method. Clearly, if you have root systems grown from seed, they're going to have a very different morphology than if they are clonal. I've shown you data on pruning management, that certainly strongly affects root distribution. We know soil type will. We still have to look, do these kinds of measurements across multiple soil types. We have some indications that scion has a strong effect. We found carbohydrate dynamics in particular are really affected by the type of scion. And again, it's the carbohydrates flow from the shoot that determines how much root growth you're going to get. And early irrigation management is important in terms of trying to affect root depth distribution. And to put it all together, we really do need modeling, because there's no way that we can do experiments that are going to cover all of this area. So we would want to aggregate all of the data from all of the various experiments we do with almond roots to develop or to add to these models that Brian's lab is developing. So we've had these discussions, Brian and I, for a while, and we really would like to have or to develop a 3D model that incorporates both the top, the bottom, and any kind of soil management and how the tree is going to respond. Some of the key things to remember for a 3D model for root growth in particular is that we need to know where the coarse roots are before we can put in the dynamics of the fine roots. You cannot have fine roots exploring an area unless the coarse root is there. And coarse root positioning is very much affected by early tree management. This is where modeling could really help in projecting out what is going to happen when you say do not prune or prune a tree, etc., where the coarse roots will be and what is going to happen a couple of years later. On the other hand, it's the fine roots that are really having the short scale dynamics, which is where we have the need to have mini rhizotron and soil core projects to see, well, for example, if we have deficit irrigation, how quickly do the new roots grow or disappear? So we'll end up with this last slide. If we get to balancing growth again, the model would have to incorporate the fact that the shoot and the root are communicating, that there are spatial changes in soil and soil environment, there are temporal changes in soil and soil environment, as well as climate. And then there is what we do, which is going to affect our soils in terms of water, nutrients, oxygen, etc. That is going to affect root growth. And we're going to have to model what happens at the shoot level and how it feeds back to the roots. And in the end, we hope, and that's going to be the most difficult thing, is how does all of that affect yield? And with that, I would end this presentation. Bastian. I was a little bit faster. I took out some slides, so we have time for discussion.
Yes, thank you, Astrid. We have a few questions posed here. I think let's start this first one from you, Paul, is to Brian. What would be the cost price per hectare or hectare? Is this going to be affordable for farmers to use?
Yeah, I assume the question is the cost of applying kind of this 3D modeling system and the sort of cost benefit analysis. I would envision multiple ways in which it could be incorporated into production, such that it's kind of scalable, not that you would have to go for the full works, you know, all or nothing. So for example, some of the things that we're developing on developing custom crop coefficients, like the way that we would distribute that is by running the models for a suite of different scenarios and essentially generating like a lookup table that would just be better than assuming, you know, one single crop coefficient or whatever that's presumably valid across, you know, the entire valley or part of the valley. So that's a way that it would be essentially free because you could just look it up online or something like that. But then as you get more and more sophisticated, then you could bring in different pieces of it that, you know, maybe you don't have all the input data like soil texture information or things like that, but you could still at least do better than, you know, what we're doing now in order to, you know, understand how to make better decisions or to provide additional information to help support those decisions. But I would kind of, as far as adoption of this, I would envision it maybe similar to how engineering CAD systems were adopted in, you know, engineering type industries. It started with, you know, the bigger companies or firms would have maybe a dedicated person that's running these models and has that expertise. But then over time, they became easier to use, more widely available. And then you had pretty much every undergraduate, you know, degree in the country and world are teaching these skills to the point that it becomes cheaper, more accessible, such that, you know, anyone could just go in and run them and apply them. So yeah, it's hard to say like a single cost or thing, but I would envision kind of a tiered or progressive type of adoption approach.
All right, great. Thank you so much, Dr. Bailey. This next question in the chat, I believe, goes to you, Dr. Volder. Does this analysis root depth per mass assume standard berms?
I'm not 100% sure what it's referring to, but all of the data I showed was on Krimsk rootstock, and we had slightly standard. The berms were about 50 centimeters, so about almost 2 feet tall. So that would be the root depth distribution that I'm showing you. So, and the depth is measured from the top of the berm because that's where the mini rhizotron tube is located.
Okay, great. Thank you for clarifying. And then we have our next question in the chat. Will root systems / structures be different in double drip system versus micro sprinkler systems?
Yeah, absolutely, it would. And so that's just one of those questions that we're going to have to actually dig up the trees and find out. But I would assume or hypothesize up front that the micro sprinkler system is going to spread the coarse root system or structural root system much more across the orchard. And what would happen is that you're going to have bursts of fine root growth over a much larger soil volume than if you're in a double drip system where the water is limited to specific zones.
Okay, great. And then this next question is for Brian. Any comments around differences in evapotranspiration demand between variety versus pollinizer?
Yeah, one thing that we've been able to do with the 3D measurement and modeling capabilities that we've developed is look at differences between varieties planted within the same orchard and their differences in terms of water use specifically this question is referencing. And so I think intuitively, we kind of know that a bigger tree is going to use more water. So if there's, you know, size difference between varieties versus pollinizers or non-pollinizers, we would expect some difference. But the question is how much different is it? And we found that you could get up to about a 20 or 25% difference in water use between varieties, actually potentially even more than that. But we found that if you irrigated specific to the varieties, that you could save about 20% of the water in certain cases by kind of tailoring the irrigation to the different needs between the varieties. And so even if you could only realize a fraction of that, I think there's potentially significant gains to be had by irrigating based on need of the variety. And the modeling can help to actually determine how much that would be, because like I said, you know that, you know, maybe we need to water the bigger trees more, but by how much we can actually plug that into the model and determine roughly how much that difference is between the varieties.
Okay, great. Thank you, Dr. Bailey. The next question is for Dr. Volder. Is it fair to think that if you are growing almonds where you have high water table or a poor drainage layer, example is hardpan, then heading may be extra beneficial? Then would heading be extra beneficial?
See, that's an interesting question. So this is related to if you head, then you won't get nearly as much deep root growth. The thing is that the analysis in the literature suggests that rooting depth is mainly determined initially by the depth of the water table. So whether you head or not in such a situation, the roots will stay above the water table anyway. If you're concerned that flooding might actually hurt your tree roots and you would want them to stay shallow, then that's a slightly different situation. The literature there again suggests the roots will go where the water table is more or less constant. So you will, under a flood situation, actually experience that the whole root system will be submerged. In my observation, it usually is that it doesn't kill the roots, it prevents new root growth. So depending on how much or how long the flooding stays, you will have a reduction in root growth if your orchard is flooded. And then if you were to head the trees at the same time, you are actually going to reduce the amount of carbohydrates available for regrowth of the new root system. So in that case, heading and pruning might actually be detrimental to the trees, because you want to set up the tree for regrowing the roots as soon as the flooding is gone.
Okay, great. Thank you. And Dr. Boulder, I believe this question's for you, but correct me if I'm wrong. Is there some technology to study the root structure without removal of the soil and kill the tree?
Okay. Yes, there are technologies. There's ground penetrating radar. The resolution of that is not very good. There's a trade-off there. Either you can go deep, but then your resolution starts getting into the inches, so you are not going to get the fine root dynamics. Or you can go fairly shallow, and then your resolution gets a little bit better, but it will still not get you to fine root. However, air spading, what you saw us do, doesn't necessarily kill the tree. If we had wanted to study the root structures and not just measure the whole tree biomass, we could have just refilled those trenches and the trees would have just grown and would have just continued to grow.
Okay, great. Thank you. And this next question, I believe, is back to you, Dr. Boulder. Regarding the root structure distribution study, are you working on soil carbon compost applications affecting on root development? And if so, can you please elaborate?
Yes, so we are also working on that. We are collecting samples in the full orchard recycling study. And there we are looking at root density, root depth distribution, and we certainly find that if you have more soil carbon in the soil, or more organic matter in particular, you get a proliferation of fine root production. And also, what is going to change is the microbial structures, and we're measuring on that. We're measuring those as well, and we find more decomposing microbes in the rhizosphere around the fine roots.
Okay, great. Thank you. And then one more for you, Dr. Boulder. Since you have detailed above and below ground biomass measurements, will you be considering models for carbon sequestration for almond production?
Yes, absolutely. We have the data to actually start working on that. It will be one of the future projects.
Okay, great. And I believe this next question is for both of you guys. How have 3D tree models discussed today been used to stimulate effects of common almond pest and disease damage?
Yeah, we haven't looked at diseases and pests in almonds specifically yet, but I have in grapevine previously. Before coming to UC Davis, that's more what I worked on. And so one of the things that we worked the most on was on powdery mildew in grapes. But I think the framework that we're developing is generally applicable. So with any disease or pest, you have kind of these common things that you need to predict in order to understand how they progress. You need to know how much susceptible plant material you have available. So that comes through simulating growth and development, and localized conditions. You need a favorable microclimate for them to proliferate, and so that comes from these microclimate and the various energy models that we have within the framework already. So we have the framework and infrastructure in place. We've just focused more on growth and things related to growth and water so far, but it's certainly an opportunity for the future.
Great. Dr. Volder, do you have anything to add there?
The one thing that we will be looking at in the future related to the roots is how the 3D structure at the root stem interface is going to affect the incidence of root diseases, because we will be looking at root cracking, and this is where the models can be very useful as well, as how many roots can you have appear at the base there before you're going to get cracks that will allow root diseases to enter the tree.
Okay, great. Thank you. So this next question, are you looking at plant technique versus root structure? And then agar versus shoveling versus slip planting?
Yes, so we're not. It could be one of the projects in the future. There's so many things that are going to affect your root system. The one comparison we do have is pot-grown trees with a very fibrous root system versus a bare root system. And the root production patterns for fine root actually turn out to be very similar.
Okay, great. Thank you. And then this next one, for tree windfall is often a problem associated to rootstock type, but any thoughts about management that may have prompted those trees to be more susceptible to windfall?
Yeah, that's could potentially be related to planting as well. In order to develop a very strong structural root system, you need to allow the tree to move, which is kind of ironic. And quite often people in windy areas tie the trees so tight that they don't allow the development of a root system, which means that if you were to ever remove the tie, you would actually be more likely to have the tree fall over. So it's a balance there where you might want to help the tree out, but only tie it very loosely, even if you're in a windy area, to allow the root system to develop.
Okay, great. Well, does anyone else have any remaining questions they would like to ask? And Sebastian, do you have any thoughts you want to give?
Well, no, thanks to the speakers for their very basic research and the trying to answer very fundamental knowledge, trying to develop very fundamental knowledge. So thanks to both of you. We didn't talk that much about, Brian, this spur dynamic word that you mentioned at the end, but I also think that that's very interesting. We understand that we need a lot of spurs flowering, setting fruit, and producing big kernels. And once they do that, they tend to go into an off year or die. So really understanding how all that dynamic can actually result in an equation that it's sustainable through time and get us good yields is also, I know what you have been working on, and I think it's also very interesting. It will help us to improve our management, our horticulture management, and that's what you guys are working. So we appreciate your effort and expertise in this area. So thank you.
Okay, great. Yes, I want to thank you all for joining us this morning. We are holding these training Tuesdays twice a month. And in the chat, I have the link to our schedule. It's just our events page on almonds.com/events. And so thank you all for tuning in. And thank you to Dr. Bailey and Dr. Volder for your time and expertise this morning.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.